my name is Michelle Stevie. I'm the senior habitat biologist for City of Olympia and also the stream team coordinator. And as I was saying, this is our first hybrid in person and also Zoom. So you'll have to give us feedback on how that works for you. But we are going to be recording Tom's talk tonight, and it'll be on our stream team website. Under the reference page at the top, there's videos and what have you, and then just click on that and you'll be able to get into it. So our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Thomas Mumford. He's a marine scientist that's been working over 45 years, and he's pretty much the lead scientist or one of the lead scientists doing kelp work tonight in Washington State and on Puget Sound. So I'll let you go into more detail, Tom, on what you're doing.
Okay. Over here. This is a first for me in 3 years, getting up in front of somebody and talking, because usually I'm on the other end of the Zoom, right? So this is a treat for me personally, just to be here and to be talking with people and not being totally freaked out about the whole situation. Anyway, Tom Mumford. My background is I got a PhD back when at the University of Washington in seaweeds, and then went up to UBC, came out here and started working for DNR in 1976 with Casey's dad, right? If I'm not mistaken. I retired about 10 years ago, and as Michelle was going to find out, when you retire, you don't really retire, you just change course a little bit. So I've been teaching up at Party Harbor and doing all kinds of fun things with kelp, and you'll see some of this, how this goes. It's kind of fun. So tonight's talk is going to go a mile a minute. Let's save questions if you can until the end, and we'll go from there. And then hopefully we'll get through and have time to actually have a little discussion here at the end. So Leslie, you want to fire it up? Okay, we got it going there. All right. My problem here is that I'm going to turn around. You can all see the back of my head, right? Okay, so anyway, did we get this to go? Oh, no. On, off. We're going to make it work. It's never simple, is it? There we go. All right. So talking about kelp, but I didn't want to put kelp in context a little bit. There's a lot of different kinds of seaweeds in the state of Washington, and that's been my specialty. Over 600 and now, is this going to go on life on its own? I want to go back one. Not going. Back one. Can you do it? Not going either way. Power's on. There we go. All right. Anyway, seaweeds come in basically 3 flavors, greens and browns and reds. And there are about 625 different kinds here. A lot of the red seaweeds look red. Some don't look quite so red, but they're a whole different group. And they're actually an ancestor to the green algae, which are down here in the bottom. And then they're the brown algae, which are actually in a whole different kind of a group phylogenetically. 625 species, and the kelp are part of this brown seaweed world. And there are 22, 23, depending upon who you want to believe, different species. One of the most diverse groups of kelp in the world. There's a few more in northern Japan and British Columbia, but we're right up there. 22 different kinds of kelp that we've got here. We made a poster, and actually it was the Puget Sound action team. We made this great poster. Andrea Dingledine did this. We going or not back there? Okay, I can need to talk more louder into the microphone. Project, right? So all you Zoom people out there, if you're there and if you can hear me, welcome. As I said, it's usually I'm on the other end of this, on the receiving end of these Zoom things. One of my favorite techie stories years ago, I was at a conference and they had the thing up like this and it was upside down. And when the people in the black t-shirts come out, the techies came out and they were looking at it. And some like fisherman guy stands up, grabs this huge projector, turns the projector upside down, puts it back down. And you should have seen the look on everybody's face. It was great. How we doing back there? Oh boy. Okay. Thank you all. How many Zoom meetings have we been in where this is about what happened? How many of you been in one of these things where they have the owl that moves around and follows people? Have you been in one of those soon? Oh my God. These cameras like this, but they'll track you. And when somebody talks, they'll go to whoever is talking. They can hear now? Can we put this on display then? Can you make it? Okay, now it's going. All right. There we go. All right. Leslie, how we doing over there? We okay? I'll talk into the microphone. Okay, great. Just a word of warning, a few things that are not kelp. Rockweed, the fucus, is not a kelp. It's not in that order, that group of things that we normally consider to be kelp. And the other one that people also confuse is this introduced species, sargassum. Most of you, if you've been on the beach very much, have seen this. It doesn't belong here. And in fact, it's a bit of a problem. Come on, guys. Leslie. Can you do that by hand if I just say next? Yeah. If I say next, good. We'll do it that way. So we normally think about sort of 3 different layers of kelp because they come, it's like a rainforest. You've got a canopy, you've got a mid-story, and you've got understory kelp in these things. So they make a very complex 3-dimensional structure in the water. We've got floating kelp, we've got what they call stipitate behind the sign there, and then those prostate kelp are the ones that are on the bottom. Next slide. Next, yes? No. So this issue may not be, it may be the Zoom thing, thinking about it. Anyway, oh no, now we've got. You're just going through slides now. Yeah. So anyway, it's a diverse group, lots of different species. Most of them are big. They're like a foot to 150 feet in size. So, and they occur in a lot of different places in the state of Washington. Here's a map that we made around about 2000, and it has the floating and the non-floating kelp. So we talk about the floating kelp ones that actually have a little balloon on them, if they will, and they float at the surface. And those are the ones that are in the orange And then also you've got the ones in the non-floating, which is the ones in the yellow. And the truth of the matter is, usually where there's floating kelp, there's also non-floating kelp. So there's kelp around on a lot of this state of Washington. I love going to Friday Harbor and saying, you guys, you don't realize this, but you're totally surrounded by kelp. You can't get off this island without going across kelp when you think about that. Next slide. Okay, so floating kelp, there's two big species we have here. This is Macrocystis, which is the one that's off in California. You've been to California, you've seen how that works. There's all the kelp up and off the coast. It's the same species. It has little floats on it. And if you look, there's little tiny floats here. So this thing is actually at the surface, and this is what it looks like from the shore. The other species that's much more predominant here in Puget Sound is on the next slide, which is the bull kelp. And I think people have been around very much in Puget Sound at all, you know what bull kelp looks like. It's a long tube, if you will, with a float on the end, and then it has the blades that come out the end of that. And it's fairly common, and we'll talk quite a bit about it because one, it's kind of iconic, and two, both of those species are pretty easy to map. They're not like the ones that are under the water. If they're at the surface, then you kind of see where they're at. Next slide. So all these different kinds of kelp that you've got here, but the truth of the matter is that really is just these floating kelp are just the tip of the iceberg. So you've got all these other 20 some odd species underneath. So let's just kind of click through these. This is the bull kelp, floats to the surface. Next. So again, you've got, and let's just click through these. These are just pictures of all these different species of kelp. So you've got the stipitate ones that have kind of stalk that stick up, and usually they're anywhere from this high to maybe 6 feet up, and then the blades are at the top of that. Then you've got a bunch of the sessile ones that are basically just the stipe, the stalk, if you will, is short, so they lay down on the bottom, as opposed to being in midwater or up on the top. Next, again, different species you've got here. And again, these are often big. They're anywhere from a foot up. And I say up because bull kelp could be 150 feet long. Next slide. More examples here. But the point I want to make, and this is the fun part, but this is where people get a little sidetracked, is all these big kelp, everybody runs around, looks at them, and they get all excited about them, and we'll talk about what they can do. It's only half the story. And I say that because look at the next slide. So a little biology here. Ferns do the same thing, mosses do the same thing, but this has what they call the life history is not just a simple one makes the next one makes the next one. You know, we don't have an alternate life history, right? Egg, sperm makes another human being like us. These guys, so here's the example of the plant, the big plant, what they call the sporophyte. And it's diploid like us, 2 sets of chromosomes, right? Remember your high school biology? And so have meiosis, and they make little tiny zoospores. Basically, 15 of those lined up would be the width of a hair, and they swim. And half of them will settle down and make a little tiny filamentous plant that are males. The other half settle down and make a plant that is a female plant. And these live for probably years. We don't really know much about them because they're microscopic. They're tiny things. The egg then gives off a chemical that causes the male to become fertile. It tracks the male gamete over. You get fertilization, and then you get the sporophyte again. So this is obligatory. So when we talk about how we're losing kelp and we're talking about what happens to kelp, yeah, we love to talk about all the sporophytes over on this side, but the truth of the matter is it has to go through both of these to be successful. You got to have the little guys to make the big ones, and the big ones to make the little ones. Next slide. So here's just some microscopic pictures of these. Here's some of these little filaments. So these plants, you could probably barely see that with the naked eye. It would be almost invisible, small. That's how tiny those things are. They're really tiny. And they live in nooks and crannies, under rocks, in rocks, tucked into around things. They grow on the top of other seaweeds. They're all over the place. And we don't really know much about them. Next slide. Here's the male, female, and there's the little tiny kelp plant that's going to be the big kelp again. Next slide. Actually, yeah, next slide. This is how let's go back one. You go back one. These are cylinders wrapped with string, and you can seed them with these guys here. And when you grow kelp commercially, have a kelp farm, that's what you use. This is the stuff you put out on the rope that will then make little baby kelp plants like this, that's then grow to be the kelp when you grow it. So when you grow kelp, you have to go through these two parts of the life history. Next slide. So that's just kind of how many there are and roughly where they are. They grow in the photic zone, so they grow down to about around here, about 50 feet maybe is the lowest, 50 feet down. Below that, there's really not enough light to get them going. So anywhere between 50 feet up into the intertidal is where you find these things. And you saw the distribution map. They're all around, pretty much all around Puget Sound, particularly the outer coast. If you go to the outer coast, there's a lot of kelp out there. You walk the outer, anybody hike the coast out there, you know what I'm talking about. It is all over everywhere. So what about this? Why are we concerned about it? What's the importance of it in the ecosystem? And this has been really fascinating. Just in the last 5 to 10 years, the knowledge of this has exploded. So the thing that has turned out to be really interesting is the fact that these plants can photosynthesize, capture carbon, turn it into a kelp plant at an enormously high rate. And this has been the sort of the big eye opener for everybody. And we'll talk more about how much, and then where does all that food go? It makes all this big kelp plant. What happens to it? So it impacts sediment movement. I won't talk much about that, but basically a kelp bed can shelter, act like a breakwater, so you don't have as much wave action on the beach, like on the outer coast. It gets to be fairly important. And it can also attenuate waves. In other words, the kelp will slow down currents and then things settle down into it. So there's a whole world of larval trapping that goes on. But the other thing besides the productivity that people have known a lot about, and we're getting to know more about, is the fact that this three-dimensional, these big things make a lot of habitat. And they make a lot of habitat in different ways. They can be a refuge, a place to hide. If you're a little fish, don't want to get eaten, you can go hide in the kelp bed, underneath the kelp, get in around the kelp. It can be a spawning substrate. Herring love to lay their eggs on kelp, for instance, okay? And then there's also this whole thing of rearing and migration. And you stream team people all have these nice streams that you make little baby salmon in, right? They all come out and most of them end up in a kelp bed on their migration out to the ocean. And I think it's the thing that's become obvious now is that, for instance, the important nearshore habitat for Chinook may be as important as the streams. In other words, if you lose that migratory pattern going out, they don't do very well. And there are some other reasons for this as well. So next slide. So let's talk about the primary productivity. This is a slide that sort of compares the product. Whoa, back one. Did I do that? Whoa. All right, here we go. Okay. So this graph, if you look at kind of the bars here on the bottom, you can't really see this, but it's kilograms of carbon. So what's a kilogram is what, about a half a pound of carbon fixed per year per meter square. So that's kind of how they do this. And open ocean, you know, and up until you get into the seagrasses and kelp. And actually, people now are thinking it's probably closer to 4. Okay, there's a lot more different studies going on, but the productivity on this basically is really high as compared to other kinds of things. And it's as, if not higher than things like tropical rainforests or alfalfa fields or sugarcane, those things they normally think about being really productive. This stuff really cranks it out really fast. Now let's just, look at this. It's going to work. Or wizard back here. So this is just what happens. This is a really cool thing that we do with the students at Friday Harbor. But here's a little diagram of a kelp plant, right? Oh, now we got carried away here. Spoiler alert. Little kelp plant, a blade, and it has a stipe, which is just the stalk, if you will. And then it has what is called a holdfast. So these plants don't actually have roots per se. They attach to things. Been on the beach, they're on rocks and this kind of stuff. They're like little suction cups. If you take one of these plants, and what we do with this is we punch holes with a little tiny hole punch, like a soda straw, and go boom, 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 down, and you start these things off, and they'll be equal distances apart, right? You come back about a week later, and you measure the distance between these holes, and you measure the total length. And what you've discovered is that these plants grow from the bottom, because see, these two holes have spread out a little bit, but it didn't necessarily get any longer, because the end is like a flag. It tatters and goes off, right? And then if you keep doing this, the same kind of a thing, that bottom hole gets, or the spacing gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And at the end of this, what we discover is, and this takes like a month, these plants turn over 4 to 5 times a year. They don't get any bigger, but the biomass is 4 to 5 times what you see. Okay. And what happens is all this stuff out here becomes what they call particulate matter. It's just grunge. You go out in the bay and it looks kind of cloudy and murky. Some of it's plankton. A lot of it's this stuff. Okay. The other thing that this does, who here has picked up a piece of kelp and it's slimy? It was like somebody blew their nose on it, right? So that's this, what they exudate. It's just material, carbohydrates that are just sloughed off. And usually you think about it, it keeps things from settling on it. But up to 35% of that productivity is just slime. And so it goes off. And what happens then is this old diagram, but it turns out to be really a cool one. So if you look at this, this is a kelp plant, sort of diagrammatically, right? About a kilogram. This is grams carbon. So about 1,000 grams of carbon per year, right? What they found was that the plant only is grazed by, eaten by things, only maybe 1%, not very much at all, right? The debris, this is just when they come loose and when it comes off the bottom and washes up on the beach, that's about 10%, right? And you look at the particulate matter, 3/4 of that plant material, the productivity, that 1,000 grams just goes off into gunk, just debris. I'm not debris, but just, particulate stuff. And then about 1/3 of it is this dissolved material. So what happens then is that this gets eaten by filter feeders, bacteria, protozoans, feces, all this different kind of stuff. All this productivity isn't necessarily going into things like that you normally think about, things that eat kelp, urchins and things like that, but all this other part of the food web. And so here's a little better diagram of this thing. So you've got this picture where you've got the kelp itself and the seagrasses. Some of it gets put up in the rack up on the beach, right? Some of it goes into DOM, but they go into microorganisms, filter feeders, clams, oysters, mussels, those sorts of things, plankton, you got these things, which then goes up the food web. All right. And the really fun thing has been about the last 5 years it's happened here is that people are beginning to say, where does all that stuff go? And kind of some numbers there, but there's also these numbers. So what they're finding is that some of this gets washed up on sandy beaches. Picture in California, right? Picture here of a macrocystis out on the beach on the outer coast. If you notice it, it's got these little white areas around here. How many people have tried to sleep on a beach on the outer coast with the beach hoppers? Anybody? Well, what they do is they eat the kelp. Some of this stuff goes into subtidal areas. Some of it gets put into offshore surface waters. It floats away. Bunch of it ends up in deep oceans. And this, we'll talk about this in a minute. Carbon sequestration is the big one for this one. So it gets washed out and sunk and then goes into the sediments in the bottom. So basically we're finding that this stuff gets carbon, kelp carbon gets around. Then we started looking at the carbon isotope ratios, carbon 12 versus carbon 13. You can do the same with nitrogen, these things, and you can trace the food through the food web. And you can say who eats who. Anybody here ever see that old movie? It was called Corn. Remember that? There was a movie that two guys, and they tried to figure out using this technique, how much of us is corn. It's like 30% of us is corn, okay? You can do the same thing. You can do the same thing with kelp. And these are, man, this thing's got a mind of its own. So if you look at the percent of the carbon in these different organisms, you can do this using this isotope tracing method. You start looking at things like a mussel, and a mussel is anywhere between 30 to 35% kelp carbon. It's not plankton. It's that detritus, that little crud that comes off the end of the kelp plant. Corals, barnacles. Barnacles are 80%. They sit there and they filter feed. 80% of that, these barnacles are made out of kelp. And things like rock jingles and the mysids, these little shrimp. Look at this. They're all 30, 40, 50% kelp, right? You get down here to amphipods and crab. A crab is like 10 to 25% kelp. And then you start getting down to the big things. You get rockfish and sea stars and these kind of people. And again, the rockfish in particular, they've done a bunch of studies on these things. 40 to 50, 60% of those rockfish are kelp. So they don't eat the kelp, but they eat something that ate the kelp that ate the kelp, probably, right? So it goes up the food web. So you start down here fairly low in the food web and you go up. Anyway, this has been the eye opener. So the big question is, if your kelp is disappearing, what happens to all these critters that don't have the food? Do they find an alternate food or do they disappear? That is the big eye opener. Aha, it's come out of this whole business in the last, I would say, 5 years. People are beginning to go, what happens? The other big part of this is the habitat. And as I mentioned right first off, there's an amazing amount of three-dimensionality in these kelp beds. The kelp forest. They call it a forest in the sense that you've got bottom, middle, and top, and all these different things that live in, around, feed on things that are in and around. This is a California picture, but it's perfectly applicable for particularly the outer coast here. And so what we're discovering is that this relationship to the habitat is really important. So where they hide, where they migrate, where they can lay eggs, these kinds of things. This is really, really important for these things. And when you lose the kelp, you lose the habitat in these things. So this slide's kind of interesting. Anybody in South Sound that's been around for a while that ever fished, and now I've talked to a lot of people who used to fish for rockfish in South Sound, going, oh my God, the kelp's gone, the rockfish are gone. They're just, if you want to go fishing for rockfish, you go find a kelp bed, a bull kelp bed, right? That's the way it worked. And when the bull kelp, we'll talk about this in a minute, have disappeared, the rockfish have disappeared. Now, it may be a little more complicated than that, but basically, where you fish, tribal people will tell you this, just recreational fishers will all tell you the same story. Kelp beds and fish are they're really all work together. And so when they started listing rockfish for Endangered Species Act, the NOAA people went and did all their homework, and they discovered that The only place that the juvenile rockfish really do well is in a kelp bed. This is what the wording was right here. Without that kelp bed, there were no adults because the juveniles weren't able to survive. And so they started about 2018, 2019, looking very carefully at, if you're going to recover rockfish, you got to recover the kelp beds. And they started, the NOAA folks started putting money into and thinking about how do you restore or maintain, conserve kelp beds. And this is really the kicker that got everybody thinking about this. It was a habitat issue. It wasn't a food thing, but it was the habitat part of the picture that turned out to be really important here. So productivity and habitat are the two big things that I flag and say, this is why we care about kelp. We can go on and on about this. There's all kinds of nooks and crannies and food web, trophic cascades and all kinds of fun things with this. But the bottom line is, it turns out that kelp drives a huge amount of the nearshore and even deeper water habitats. It also drives a lot, they're finding more and more, like we're talking about beach rat. It's full of little beach hoppers, okay? Who eats the beach hoppers? Birds. Who eats the birds? And so the kelp, we haven't done it yet, but the kelp carbon story is going to go into the marine environment as well. And I'm waiting for somebody to get an orchid and see how much of an orchid is kelp. That's what I really want to find out. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about how, so these are sort of the ecological uses. How now we talk a little bit more about the human uses, which are interesting in their own right. Kelp has been around for quite a while, and people have used it for various reasons for quite a while. Just a slight aside here, the word kelp, I think it's Gaelic, and it referred to not the seaweed, but when you burned the seaweed, you made kelp, which is this potash, basically. And so there's and then it gradually turned into the word kelp meant the seaweed itself, not the potash. But there's a litany of things. I'll have a few more slides here, but it's been used for food for a long time. Now, nori is not kelp, but there's been a lot of different, we'll see some pictures here, it's human food, okay? Particularly in Asia, not so much in North America, but, or even in Europe, but a lot of Asian cuisine has kelp in it. It's been used as a fodder, and this is going to be real interesting because it's been used as a fodder for a long time. Places in Scotland, there are sheep that only eat kelp. I have a blanket made from sheep that only eat kelp, and I hold it up and I say, this is 100% kelp blanket. It's a beautiful blanket too, by the way. It's really neat. So what they're doing now is they're figuring out how to feed not just kelp, but other seaweed, kelp too, reduce methane reduction in cows. So it reduces the methane emission from particularly like dairy cows. Not the same as the red algae, but it does work. Well, I'll show you some pictures here for fiber. Fertilizer and soil conditioner. In the San Juans, a big commotion about the fact that everybody would just take the pickup truck down in the fall, load it up with kelp, take it home and put it in their garden. People were trying to stop that from happening. There are places in Scotland, the lazy beds and all the soil in places like Scotland and Ireland, it's all composted kelp. There was no soil there. They'd made it out of kelp. So all those potatoes that people are growing in Ireland, kelp. Different kinds of drugs, chemicals, said the potash and so forth. The other thing that turns out kelp is full of is iodine. Iodine was discovered in the chimney of those when they burned kelp. The crystals of iodine crystallized on the chimney. And that's how when they discovered, because it came out of the kelp. Lots of different biochemicals. The alginate is the one that comes out of kelp, not carrageenan and not agar, but the alginate. A lot of different cosmetic uses. We'll talk a little about biomass. When you make that much carbon, you fix that much carbon, think about it, you can turn that into gas, you can turn it into biofuels. Habitat we talked about. Carbon sequestration become a big issue. So you can fix all this carbon, and I'm working on a project right now. Where do you put it so it doesn't turn back into carbon dioxide again permanently or a long-term sequestration? Lots of big money, lots of people thinking really hard about this right now. Nutrient remediation. It takes up nutrients. All that growth has to also use nitrogen. So you can use it to soak up nitrogen. And then there's always the restoration, what I call restoration and compensatory mitigation component to this. So, so the traditional uses have been very interesting, and we'll show you in a minute here how that works. But some of these are just some drawings out of a book about some of the traditional uses of kelp. So substrate for herring spawn in particular. The other one that I always thought was really fascinating, and this is, I've talked to various people about this, a kelp bed along the beach, and the salmon migrating in, the adults follow the kelp bed. And you can ask anybody out in Port Angeles where they go to troll for salmon, right along the edge of the kelp bed. So the tribes would cut a hole, and then the fish would migrate and then come in, and then they would concentrate the fish, basically the fish trap and these kind of things. The food aspect now, these are sort of what I call traditional Asian-oriented food times. Ever eat miso soup? Little squares in there. It's all kelp. You got it. But the thing has been fun. That's sort of old school. Okay. Last couple of years, all of a sudden, it's high cuisine time. You go into these restaurants and they'll serve you for $50 this little tiny bit of kelp drizzled with something on top of it on a white plate, right? So it's gotten to be a big deal. Not much kelp being used, but it certainly sort of entered what I call the high food era, if you will. Then there's all these other things that the alginate. So when the slime that comes out of kelp is this polysaccharide, it's a goop. And it's called alginic acid. It's a compound, it's a long chain. It's like a sugar, it's a chain of sugars, basically. Look at the different things that this stuff goes into that you never, ever would dream about. You never think about all these different things that it gets used in. And the one that I find fascinating is it's apparently a big deal in like textile and printing. Okay. High-speed printing goes really fast. The ink doesn't keep it from slinging off the rollers. They put this gel in it, hold it on there. I mean, things you would never, ever think of. Recently, there's been a huge amount of effort, and there's a number of companies now beginning to make bioplastics. And the fundamental stuff that most of those are made out of is alginate from kelp. So there's this huge market now, wild harvest going on to try to satisfy how you make these bioplastics. And one of the fun things that I read about, I haven't seen it yet, in marathons, everybody drinks out of paper cups on the way, and they throw the paper cups along the road. These guys, and there's the paper cups. It's a mess, right? You take water and you coat it with, there's a called spherification. You coat it with alginic acid, which you can eat. So you just take one of these little things of water, just pop in your mouth, no waste. Okay. So there's a big industry. I'm not going to get into this too much. Farming kelp, particularly in places like China and South Korea and Japan. Farming kelp is big. It's just getting started here in Washington, Oregon, Alaska, not so much in Oregon and Maine, places like this. But it's basically, you take those strings that I showed you the picture of, and you wrap them around a rope, and you let it grow for about 6 months, and there you go. You got kelp, okay? And it is, in some parts of the world, a very, very large business. Started in China, interestingly enough, to provide iodine for boiler prevention all through China. So they didn't eat it so much for the food, it was for the iodine. So some other things that we need to mention here real quick is that some of the other uses that are becoming more important, using kelp to suck up the CO2 to change the pH, to change ocean acidification. Ocean acidification is a big deal, particularly with shellfish people. And we've already been doing some experiments where you can take a kelp farm and then look at the pH around the kelp farm, place it next to a shellfish farm, and the shellfish do much better. I haven't been talking to them, but they might be doing better because all that particulate matter they're getting to eat, but we're working on that one. So again, the Puget Sound Restoration Fund has got a big project right now working on how does this in fact work, and is it scalable? Is it something we can really use with shellfish farms? The other one is this nutrient remediation. You not only suck up carbon dioxide with all this kelp, but you could also suck up a lot of nitrogen. And if you put it adjacent to salmon pen, some other kind of operation that gives off a lot of nitrogen, sewer outfalls and so forth, and then you use the kelp for something else, making alginic acid. Or what I've been involved in several projects, these are old pictures, but the idea that basically you can grow all this kelp, it makes biomass, then you do varying kinds of techniques to use it to make biogas or to make biofuels, turn it into gasoline, turn it into and so forth. So you're basically, instead of taking the carbon out of the ground, you're recycling the carbon for this system for fuels. I have to put this picture in because it's kind of fun. What else can you do with kelp besides all these sort of serious things? Maybe not quite so serious, but my wife makes kelp baskets. Take the dried kelp and do that. I was just saying here before we started, this woman, Josie Esselin, does artwork. This is the shower curtain you buy from her. It's quite lovely. And then I always have to have a kelp horn. People blown kelp horns before. You cut them and they're hollow. They make like a tube and you can blow on them. 4th of July parade at Friday Harbor. And you should see people going, what is that? What are they doing? It's really fun. So here's the downside of this whole story. We'll go through this fairly quickly because we're losing kelp. Things in Puget Sound are not doing well. Actually, worldwide, things are not doing well. And there's a whole litany of what could be going on that would make kelp not happy. The truth is, we're just in the last few years beginning to really get our handle on this thing. And then just keep in mind here that we all these different things going on. Light availability. Oh, no. Boy, this thing has got a mind of its own. So all these different things that can influence the kelp. The important thing I want to emphasize here is we worry about and we can measure the loss of the big part of the kelp, the sporophyte. We don't know very much about where and what the effects are on the gametophytes. We're beginning to figure it out. Remember, you have to go through the cycle. So if you lose half, you don't get the other half. It takes the whole thing to make it work. But here's just some pictures worldwide. It's not a pretty situation. And everybody's beginning to point their finger at global warming. Global warming is probably the problem. Kelp likes to be cold. It's an Arctic, cold temperate plant worldwide. There are really very few, actually no tropical kelp. It's only found in the colder parts of the world. So there's just some pictures we've got talking about that. Closer to home for all you folks here in South Sound, they started making maps in the 1870s. They were called T-sheets. They were the predecessors to topographic maps. And they had charts and they had what they call the topo maps. And the topo maps were really interesting because here's one for South Sound. So here's Anderson Island, and here's a Devil's Head here. And if you look at these very carefully, there are along the margins here, these little squiggly things right here. They map these very carefully. They're kelp, floating kelp. The reason was because they knew that if they were shallow enough to have rocks, or you didn't want to sail there. So they mapped these to indicate it was a navigation marker. So they were meticulous about, and these are the 1870s. I love it. And we've gone through a lot of these maps and figured out where kelp was in 1870. And another one was done in 1912 when they wanted a potash supply for making potash during World War I and acetone. They mapped every square inch of kelp between Baja California and the Aleutians, including Puget Sound, this kind of stuff. But here's the sad story. And we published a paper on this with Helen Berry and I did at DNR, where it was blue was near as we could tell, all the charts, the maps, and all the historical records, there's where kelp was. And right now, there's only a few beds left where it's pink in the Narrows. And we'll talk a little bit more about this bed here at Squaxin Island. But basically, it's really gone. I mean, it's like 80% of the, 90% of the kelp is gone. Bull kelp, okay? Here's the Squaxin Island bed. This was the original sort of bed extent here. This is 2022. We've only got 80 plants left there. And now I'm not the least bit convinced we're going to have any this year. I have a Noah's Ark gametophyte culture in my office in a cooler because I think it's going to be, it's like the last dodo in the zoo kind of a thing. On the other hand, here at Salmon Bank, where there's a lot of currents, it's done pretty well. And here's kind of the story when you start looking at the different temperatures. And it turns out that 16 and 18 are kind of the two temperatures where things don't go well. 16 for the sporophytes, 18 for the gametophytes. And as you can see here at Salmon Beach, things are not too bad, but you start getting into Squaxin Island, and at least there's a part of the year where you're above the temperature at which they can really make it. So temperature, folks. The other scary thing, this is a little more complicated graph here, but basically this is the understory kelp. This is the kelp that's not on the surface. This is the bottom kelp, and it's disappeared in 1 year. Here was all this Squaxin Island. This was all the kelp here, the understory kelp. It's gone. And at Salmon Bank, it's still pretty good, but these are scary things, folks. This is not a good situation. The other thing that we know a little bit about is on the outer coast, I started in 89 measuring kelp out there. El Nino, La Nina makes a lot of difference. So again, it's hot, cold, and the plants go up and down in response to temperature. Another big story that was kind of fun was when they broke the Elwha Dam and all the sediments came out. We tracked very carefully how that worked. And there was a lot of kelp along here. And then it pretty much disappeared when all the sediments came out because there wasn't much light. And there was soft sediments, not rocks. And now that the soft sediments have disappeared and the sediments are gone, it's coming back again. So it's been a big dip, and now it's coming back, all having to do with the Elwha Dam release. So that kelp thing I tell you about, the rockfish ESA listing triggered this study and we came up with the Puget Sound Kelp Conservation Recovery. And if you want to read any document at all, it kind of puts a big picture and gives all the background. Get this picture, get this and look at it. The idea was these are the recommendations: reduce the stressors. We're beginning to figure that out and understand the value of kelp. So we're beginning to get a better handle on what does it mean when you lose kelp and have it or not have it. Distribution and trends in kelp. Casey's cohort, Helen Berry and so forth, have a whole crew looking just at that. Designated protected areas, working on that as well. Restore kelp forests and then promote awareness. And I'm right now, this is part of my gig here. I'm the last one on the list, right? But that's kind of what I'm doing, really. So take a look at this. This is really an interesting document. Plus, it has a big appendices on the biology of kelp And then it's got another appendix on all the indigenous uses of kelp, which is really a beautiful document. One of the few that I've seen where they kind of put all the pictures together on that. So what's happened? So you've got this diagram, and I started working on this day. And I went, oh my God, I'm not going to get this done. The kelp plan has these different components to it. Here's the big circle is the kelp plan, and you've got these things inside it. And I started putting down what is going on right now. It is getting to the point where I can't keep track of it. I spend hours every day on various meetings in various aspects of this thing. There are this many or more projects going on now, all having to do with kelp. And if you please, if you want to get a hold of this document and click on some of these things. So you've got policy review, you've got people from the Pew Trust looking at how people are implementing kelp protection or not implementing kelp protection. What are the laws and how are they being implemented? You've got a health plan that DNR just started. Take a look. I got another slide for this one. The action agenda has to do with this kelp vital sign, restoration work. DNR's got a habitat strategic initiative that Casey's part of back here. Kelp expedition, research, places like Friday Harbor, looking at what are those lethal temperatures, what is pH doing, all those sorts of things. It's a world out there of people all scrambling around looking at this thing. So a couple of really cool documents I would urge you to look at. I'm just going to show a slide here. This is a story map at the Puget Sound Restoration Fund. It is gorgeous. And it tells this story that I've told with, and it's really nice. They do a really spiffy job of doing this thing, and it's animated and so forth. So that is that's a must go read it. And there's the link is where is the link? Did I not put the link on there? You can go look it up. You can Google it, you'll find it. The floating kelp indicator is another one that's in progress, and go look at that because there's a document out for public comment right now. If you want to get involved, put your finger in the pie. This is a place to do it right here. Vital signs being one of the things that are being measured in Puget Sound to say, how are we doing on recovering or losing things in Puget Sound? And Helen Berry, there's a huge effort going on right now to map all these things and making maps and GIS data points and so forth, giving indication of breaking the sound up into different components here. And is it good, bad, or indifferent? And then you can zoom in on that map, actually down to each individual kelp bed that's being mapped. It's an absolutely stunning piece of GIS work if you're a GIS freak. This one is done by the Sanish, and it's done from the viewpoint of the indigenous community. It's a lot about fishing. And again, it's beautiful story map. Puget Sound Restoration Fund has got a bunch of different things going on right now about restoration. And again, this is their website, and you can go there and look at all the different things they're doing. Kelp restoration, OA, genetics. There's a whole bunch of different projects that they're involved with. And then there's the Pew Trust. People have put out a Kelp Digest. We're working on number 2. This is an amazing document because, one, people don't know about it. 2, it's got about 2 pages of links to every one of these things I'm talking about. It's just an amazing compendium of information. So you can go there and click on all these different projects and get the information out of it. The other thing that I'll push a little bit because I'm involved with these guys for citizen involvement is the Marine Resource Committees. Now they're only for the North Sound, which is unfortunate, but it's like from Everett North and out the coast. But they're citizen groups. And one of their big projects has been measuring and monitoring kelp beds. They've done a very good job, kayak-based primarily. They're having a lot of fun. So that's kind of the end of the story here. It's exactly 7 o'clock. So, but we started late. This is a book I did years ago. It's online, but it's got a lot of information in it still. It doesn't have all the new stuff. It doesn't have all the different efforts that are going on, but the basic biology and some of that stuff is in here. So that's me. And I will say, before I answer questions here, that I'm here as a resource, and anybody wants to ask me questions, that's me. Call me up, email me. whatever. I'm more than glad to talk to people. My shtick is communicating and teaching and getting people excited about this thing. So I'm here. Okay. So how do you guys want to do you have questions from the Zoomers? How about you folks? First dibs. You showed up. Come on. Questions? What do we know about restoration efforts? Is the question. The Puget Sound Restoration Fund is actually, I was thinking on the way down, what would I tell you people what to do? And there's local stuff we can do. The sad part, or not so sad part, is that it is probably global warming, and that is not something that we can fix here, but we can certainly contribute to the solution. And we all know what that involves. So I'll just put that out there. But the question about who's doing what for restoration. So the Puget Sound Restoration Fund has been putting kelp out, planting kelp in various places, mostly in Central Sound. And the concern we've got is that they can do it for a year, but it hasn't really maintained itself. My personal opinion is you need to fix the problem before you plant kelp out. Yeah, you need to fix the global warming or pollution or whatever, So, but people are looking at it really seriously and trying a lot of different techniques to do that. Get on the Puget Sound Restoration Fund site. They've got a lot of things in playing what they're doing.
What does sea cucumber have to do with that as a potential impact of kelp?
I didn't talk about this. So the question is, how do sea cucumbers impact kelp and so forth? It turns out that there are these really fun things called trophic cascades. So who eats the kelp? Urchins and abalone, urchins in particular. But then it turns out who eats the urchins? Well, sea otters. Well, what happens if you take the sea otters out? Then you get an explosion of urchins which eat all the kelp. So there's these, what they call trophic cascades. And that's one story. The one around here that's probably more important is we're having a lot of trouble with kelp crabs eating the kelp right now. They just eat everything in sight. Who eats the kelp crab? Rockfish. No rockfish. All of a sudden you've got too many kelp crabs. So there are these really complex dynamics. But the other thing is, and what you're alluding to is, these sea cucumbers go along in little vacuum cleaners and they keep the bottom clean. These gametophytes need a clean bottom. So it may be the gametophyte part of the story. The sea cucumbers don't do much, I don't think, to the adult sporophyte big plants, but they probably very much have something to do with the gametophytes, the little fuzzy ones. I see furrowed brows over here. Anything in the chat? So the question was, how can we grow baby kelp and then help them mitigate the temperature effects? Yeah. So the technique for growing kelp has been pretty well worked out. That whole effort in like China and Japan, they figured that out in the early 1900s, that how to do the life cycle. So that they've got that pretty wired. Right now in China in particular, there's a massive effort to make kelp that can grow in warm water conditions. So where normally kelp would be growing up by Korea, they've got it growing down almost to Vietnam now. Okay, so they can select for kelp plants that can tolerate warm water temperature. And there's a huge effort, mostly done through strain selection. They're beginning to look at actual GMO, actual CRISPR kind of modification of the stuff now. So that's one of the solutions is do you try to make kelp that will tolerate warm water? And that involves selective breeding and possible modification. Answer your question? The question was, what was the effect of the Elwha Dam removal on kelp? So it wasn't just kelp, it was a number of different things. So basically there was 100 years of sediment trapped behind those two dams. And it just kept building up, and the sediment wasn't making its way out into the ocean. And so the ocean was starved of sediment. And instead of there being a sandy beach, it just turned into big cobble because all the sand got washed away. And the big cobble, bang, perfect for big kelp to hang on to, right? And so there was a lot of kelp. There was a big debate. I was involved in this. When they took the dams out, do they take them out just a little bit at a time and just dribble the mud out behind the dams, or do they just let it go? They let it go. And so there was this huge, for about 3 or 4 years, all that sediment that was trapped behind those dams washed out and rebuilt the delta, but it also made this huge plume of silty water and mud and so forth. It came out all up and down the coast for maybe 10 or 15 miles on either side of it. Two things happened. One was that the rocks got covered and it was more of a sandy, muddy bottom, which isn't very good for kelp. And there was all this silt, so there was no light. So it was a combination of two different things. Now, most of that silt has been washed out from behind the dams and is restoring it back to a more normal situation. Normal pre-1900, not normal 1950, let's say. You got to think about sort of the time frames of these things. It'll never be a 1950 kelp bed again, but it'll probably be a 1900 kelp bed again. Yes. Yes. Well, let me, so the question is, besides sargassum, what other kinds of seaweeds might be competitors and so forth? I will say, well, I didn't show a picture of it, but that kelp bed at Squaxin is solid sargassum to the point where you're going, no wonder there's no kelp there anymore. It is just taken over. It's really sad. It comes in the springtime and just makes a carpet, and it floats. It has little floats on it, so it does the same kind of floating thing. And that's a big concern. And sargassum has been around probably since the 1920s or so forth. Funny you should ask. Just today, I got the sequences back on 2 seaweeds from Quilcene. And one of them is native, one of them is not. I had one earlier. So 2 out of the 3 seaweeds that are really taking over in Quilcene right now are invasives from Japan. That probably came in with the oyster business back at some point. So yes, there are species that are of concern, but sargassum right now is probably the one that, from a kelp standpoint, is the more critical. I'm here to tell you, I'm pretty pessimistic about controlling invasives. It's pretty hard to do. And they tried to get rid of sargassum in Great Britain and didn't make it. It's so widespread. It's got a perennial holdfast. It's going to be hard to do. Ditto for things like the Japanese eelgrass. You know, just cat's out of the bag. Had any stink bugs in your house recently? Stink bugs in your house recently? Yeah. So it's a changing world. It's a changing world, folks. How many students here? Sort of. I'm going to put a plug in for Friday Harbor. If you ever want to come take a marine biology course, come do it. I'm teaching I'm not doing, well, you mean for research in the summer? No, that's Katie Dubkowski is going to be doing that one. I'm going to be teaching the summer phycology course, and I'm going to be teaching the spring Zobot undergraduate course. 10 weeks in the spring and then 5 weeks in the summer. I'm really busy. But seriously, and there's spots in both of those courses. And there's the summer research thing as well. Yeah, Katie's working on the kelp crab thing. She's big on these kelp crab and herbivory issues. See you there. All right. How we doing? No more questions out of Zoom land? All right. Well, thank you folks for coming, and thanks all of you online. I'd love to, when I get done, we'll see a list of who else was around. As I said, I'm here to answer questions into the future. This is not the end of the story by any stretch. Okay. So with that, good night. Sleep tight. Yeah. All right. You're going to put this up online?
Yes. So it's going to be on our Stream Team website. So that's streamteam.info, and it'll be on the reference pages. At the top of the reference pages, there is it says videos, I think, and something else, but you just click on that and all of our talks should be there. We've got quite a few, actually. We term these our climate conversation talks. So there's a lot of different videos that have been saved in there.